She was dragged out of the mall in
Rot
handcuffs,
in prison,
accused of being
you
a thief.
thief!
10 minutes later, she walked back in and bought the entire building. This is the story of Sharon Matthews, and what happened that day would change everything. It was a crisp Saturday morning in downtown Chicago, and 30-year-old Sharon Matthews had finally decided to treat herself. After months of grueling 12-hour days building her tech startup from the ground up, she'd earned this moment. Her company had just closed a major acquisition deal worth hundreds of millions, but you wouldn't know it by looking at her. Sharon believed in staying grounded, in remembering where she came from. So there she was, dressed casually in jeans and a simple sweater, her natural hair pulled back in a ponytail, walking through Prestige Plaza Mall with nothing but excitement in her heart. Sharon had grown up in the South Side, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She remembered pressing her face against store windows as a child, dreaming of the day she could afford the beautiful things inside. That little girl had made a promise to herself, that one day she'd walk into any store she wanted with her head held high. Today was supposed to be that day. The designer section of Prestige Plaza was everything she'd imagined. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and luxury brands lined the corridors like jewels in a crown. Sharon made her way to Luminaire, an exclusive boutique known for its handcrafted designer bags and custom jewelry. The window display caught her eye, a stunning emerald handbag that seemed to shimmer in the light. She smiled to herself. Her mother's birthday was coming up, and after everything Mom had sacrificed, she deserved something extraordinary. The moment Sharon stepped through the glass doors of Luminaire, she felt it. That subtle shift in the air, the kind black folks recognize immediately. The store attendant, a woman in her mid-30s named Miranda Walsh, looked up from her phone. Her expression changed from boredom to something else entirely, something cold and calculating. Miranda had perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and eyes that swept over Sharon with unconcealed judgment. "Can I help you?" Miranda's tone wasn't helpful. It was accusatory, each word carefully measured and dripping with skepticism. Sharon kept her smile warm, refusing to let anyone dim her joy. "Yes, I'm interested in that emerald handbag in the window. Could I take a closer look?" Miranda didn't move immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the back of the store, where a tall white man in a security uniform was standing. This was Stephen Burke, the mall's head of security, a former police officer who'd been forced to retire early after multiple complaints about excessive force. He caught Miranda's look and straightened up, his hand instinctively moving to his belt. "That piece is quite expensive," Miranda said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right store? There's a department store downstairs that might be more within your range." Sharon's smile faltered for just a moment. She'd heard these words before in 1,000 different variations throughout her life. But she was tired of proving herself, tired of having to justify her presence in spaces where she had every right to be. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sharon replied calmly. "Now, about that handbag?" Miranda made a show of walking slowly to the window display, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. She retrieved the bag with exaggerated care, as if Sharon might contaminate it with her mere presence. When she placed it on the counter, she didn't step back. Instead, she hovered, watching Sharon's every movement like a hawk circling prey. Sharon examined the bag carefully. The craftsmanship was impeccable, hand-stitched Italian leather with gold hardware. It was perfect. She could already imagine her mother's face lighting up when she opened it. "I'll take it," Sharon said. "And I'd like to look at some of your jewelry pieces as well." That's when Miranda's mask slipped completely. "I'll need to see your payment method first." "Store policy." Sharon paused. "That's not standard practice. I haven't even finished shopping yet." "It is for certain customers," Miranda replied, her meaning crystal clear. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Sharon felt her chest tighten, but she maintained her composure. She'd dealt with this kind of prejudice before, had built her entire career fighting against people who underestimated her because of the color of her skin. She slowly reached for her wallet, but as she did, her elbow accidentally brushed against a display of designer scarves near the counter. One of them, a silk piece worth several $100s, slipped off its stand. Sharon bent down to pick it up, but Miranda was already moving. "Stephen," she called out sharply. "Stephen, we have a situation." The security guard rushed over, his heavy boots thundering across the floor. Other shoppers started to notice the commotion, turning their heads with that mixture of curiosity and discomfort that comes with witnessing something uncomfortable in public. "She's trying to steal merchandise." Miranda announced, her voice pitched loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. I saw her trying to conceal that scarf. Sharon's heart began to race. I was picking it up. It fell. I was literally holding my wallet to pay for the bag. That's what they all say, Stephen said, his voice hard and unyielding. He'd been waiting for this, Sharon realized. Waiting for any excuse to exert his authority. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. I'm not going anywhere, Sharon said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a paying customer and I was in the process of making a purchase. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Sharon could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting. Some people had their phones out, recording. In this moment, Sharon wasn't a successful CEO, wasn't a woman who'd built something from nothing through sheer determination and brilliance. She was just another black woman being accused of a crime she didn't commit. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Stephen said, moving closer. His hand was on his radio now, ready to call for backup. Call your manager, Sharon said firmly. I want to speak to whoever's in charge of this store. Miranda crossed her arms. I am the senior attendant on duty, and I'm telling you that we have protocols for suspected shoplifting. Stephen, please escort her out. What happened next would be burned into Sharon's memory forever. Stephen grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. Sharon tried to pull away, but that only made him grip harder. Don't resist, he growled. I'm not resisting. You're assaulting me. But Stephen wasn't listening. With the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, he twisted Sharon's arm behind her back and pulled out a pair of zip-tie handcuffs. The plastic dug into her wrists as he tightened them. Sharon felt the tears threatening to spill over, but she refused to cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The walk through the mall was the longest of Sharon's life. Stephen paraded her through the corridors like a trophy, past the stores where she'd planned to shop, past the cafe where she'd hoped to grab lunch. People stared, some with pity, others with judgment, most with that careful neutrality that allowed them to witness injustice without having to acknowledge it. They reached the mall's main entrance, and Stephen literally dragged Sharon outside, pushing her onto the sidewalk hard enough that she stumbled. Stay out, he said. You're banned from this property. If I see you here again, I'm calling the real police and pressing charges for trespassing. He cut the zip ties with a knife, leaving red marks on Sharon's wrists. Then he turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing there on the street, humiliated and hurt. For a moment, Sharon just stood there trying to process what had happened. Her hands were shaking, her wrists throbbed, and she could still feel the eyes of every person who'd watched her be dragged out like a criminal. But then something shifted inside her. The tears that had threatened to fall dried up, replaced by something harder, something forged in the fires of every injustice she'd ever faced. Sharon pulled out her phone and made a call. David? It's Sharon. I need you to pull up all the information we have on Prestige Plaza Mall. Everything. Ownership structure, financial records, outstanding debts, management contracts, all of it. And I need it in 5 minutes. David Chin was her company's chief financial officer and her most trusted advisor. If anyone could work miracles with numbers, it was him. Sharon, what's going on? Are you okay? I will be, Sharon said, her voice cold and determined. Just get me that information. While she waited, Sharon did something else. She opened her phone's camera roll and began reviewing the footage she'd been recording. Years of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned had taught her to always protect herself. The moment she'd walked into Luminaire, she'd started a discreet recording on her phone. She had everything: Miranda's discriminatory comments, the false accusation, Stephen's excessive force. Everything. Her phone buzzed. David had come through. Sharon scanned the information quickly, her brilliant mind processing the data with the same speed that had made her company so successful. Prestige Plaza Mall was owned by Hartwell Properties Group, a real estate investment firm. And according to the financial records David had pulled up, Hartwell was in trouble. They'd overextended themselves on recent acquisitions, and several major tenants had recently left. The mall was hemorrhaging money, and Hartwell desperately needed a buyer. Sharon made another call, this time to Marcus Johnson, her company's head of real estate acquisitions. Marcus, I'm sending you information on a property. I want to make an offer. Today. Right now. Sharon, we don't usually move this fast on acquisitions. We need time to do due diligence, assess the... I've done the assessment. The property is undervalued because of current management issues. We can fix that. Draw up an all-cash offer 20% above current market value, contingent on same-day closing. Make it clear this is a take-it-or-leave-it situation. Marcus knew better than to argue when Sharon used that tone. I'll have the paperwork ready in 30 minutes. Sharon's next call was to her attorney, Jennifer Wu, one of the best civil rights lawyers in the country. Jennifer, I need you to draft a lawsuit. Discrimination, false imprisonment, assault, defamation. Hit them with everything. And I need security footage from the mall for the past hour. Sharon, what happened? Jennifer's voice was filled with concern. Sharon told her everything, her voice never wavering. When she finished, Jennifer was silent for a moment. Then, we're going to destroy them. No, Sharon said. We're going to teach them. There's a difference. 10 minutes had passed since Sharon had been thrown out of the mall. 10 minutes that had felt like a lifetime. But they'd also been the most productive 10 minutes of her life. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Hartwell accepted. They're desperate. Closing documents being prepared now. You'll own Prestige Plaza in 2 hours. Sharon smiled for the first time since entering Luminaire. She walked back toward the mall's entrance, her head held high. Stephen saw her coming and immediately moved to block her path. I told you you're banned. Leave now or I'm calling the police. Sharon looked at him calmly. Call them. Please do. I'd love to have them here for what's about to happen. And while you're at it, call your supervisor. Tell them Sharon Matthews is here and she needs to speak with them immediately. Something in her tone made Stephen pause. Who? Sharon Matthews. CEO of Matthews Tech Solutions. You might have heard of us. We're one of the largest tech companies in the Midwest. But more importantly, in about, she checked her watch, 90 minutes I'm going to be your boss. So I strongly suggest you get your supervisor. Now. Stephen's face went pale. He stammered something into his radio, and within minutes, a woman in a business suit came rushing out. This was Rebecca Torres, the mall's general manager. She looked frazzled and confused. Ms. Matthews? I'm Rebecca Torres. I'm so sorry, but I'm not sure what's happening here. Stephen said. What's happening, Sharon interrupted, her voice clear and strong, is that I was racially profiled, falsely accused of shoplifting, assaulted, and illegally detained by your staff. What's also happening is that I'm in the process of acquiring this mall. And what's going to happen next is that we're going to go inside, review the security footage of the incident, and then we're going to have a very serious conversation about the future of everyone involved. Rebecca's eyes went wide. She looked at Stephen, whose face had gone from pale to ashen, then back at Sharon. I had no idea. Please come inside. Let me. Oh, now I can come inside? Sharon's voice was sharp. 10 minutes ago, I was dragged out like a criminal. What's changed, Rebecca? Rebecca had no answer for that. The silence spoke volumes. Sharon walked back into the mall, and this time she wasn't alone. David had arrived with a team of lawyers. Marcus was there with the acquisition paperwork. Jennifer had already obtained the security footage through legal channels. And most importantly, several news crews had somehow gotten wind of what happened. Sharon might have tipped them off. She believed in transparency, especially when it came to injustice. They assembled in the mall's main conference room. Sharon and her team on one side, Rebecca, Miranda, Stephen, and several Hartwell Properties executives on the other. The security footage played on a large screen, and with each passing minute, the faces of those who'd wronged Sharon grew more worried. The footage was damning. It showed Sharon entering Luminaire with a smile. It showed Miranda's dismissive treatment from the very first moment. It captured every discriminatory comment, every baseless accusation. It showed Sharon trying to pick up the scarf she'd accidentally knocked over, and it clearly showed Miranda's deliberate escalation. Most damning of all, it showed Stephen's excessive force. The way he'd grabbed Sharon, restrained her without cause, and physically thrown her out of the mall. When the footage ended, silence filled the room. Finally, one of the Hartwell executives spoke. Ms. Matthews, we deeply apologize. This is not how we. Save it, Sharon said. Your apology means nothing if there are no consequences. If nothing changes. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. She stood up, and everyone in the room instinctively leaned forward. This was a woman who commanded attention, who'd built an empire through intelligence and determination. This was a woman who'd been underestimated one too many times and was done being silent about it. First, Miranda and Stephen, you're both fired. Effective immediately. And before you think about claiming wrongful termination, remember that we have video evidence of discrimination and assault. Jennifer here would be delighted to handle your lawsuits. Miranda started to protest, but Sharon held up her hand. You had every opportunity to treat me with basic human dignity. You chose to see my skin color before you saw me as a customer. That's on you. Sharon turned to Rebecca. As for you, you have a choice. You can leave with a severance package, or you can stay and help me rebuild this place into what it should be, a space where everyone feels welcome. But if you stay, things are going to change dramatically. No more turning a blind eye to discrimination. No more protecting employees who abuse their power. This mall is going to set a new standard. Rebecca nodded slowly. I'd like to stay. And I'd like to help make this right. Good. Your first task is to implement mandatory anti-bias training for every single employee in this mall. And I mean every single person from the CEO down to the janitors. Second, we're establishing a customer complaint system with real teeth. Every complaint will be investigated by an independent committee. Third, we're partnering with local community organizations to ensure this space serves everyone, not just the wealthy. Sharon pulled out the acquisition papers that Marcus had prepared. The Hartwell executives looked at them with resignation. They knew they had no choice. The mall was already failing, and after this incident went public, which it certainly would, they'd be finished anyway. At least this way they'd get a fair price. Sign, Sharon said simply. They signed. As the ink dried on the papers, Sharon felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes, but also sadness. She'd won, but at what cost? She thought about all the other people like her who'd been profiled, discriminated against, and humiliated, but who didn't have the resources to fight back. How many of them had walked away broken, internalizing the message that they didn't belong? Sharon walked back to Luminaire, the store that had started all of this. The emerald handbag was still sitting on the counter where Miranda had left it. A new employee, a young black woman who looked terrified, approached her. Can I help you, ma'am? Sharon smiled gently. What's your name? Jasmine. Jasmine Williams. I just started here last week. Well, Jasmine, I'm Sharon Matthews and I now own this mall. I want to buy that emerald handbag. It's for my mother. She sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities she never had. And I want to make sure that you and everyone who works here knows that you belong in this space just as much as anyone else. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. Actually, Sharon said softly, I do. As Jasmine carefully wrapped the handbag, Sharon looked around the store. This was just one battle in a much larger war, she knew. But it was a battle she'd won, and that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Sharon's transformation of Prestige Plaza became national news. The security footage went viral, sparking conversations about racial profiling in retail spaces across the country. Other mall owners and retailers reached out, wanting to implement similar anti-discrimination policies. Sharon's company launched an initiative to train retail employees in unconscious bias recognition. But the most meaningful change happened locally. Sharon opened a mentorship program at the mall, connecting young people from underserved communities with successful business owners. She renovated a section of the mall into affordable retail spaces for minority-owned small businesses. She created a scholarship fund for employees who wanted to pursue higher education. And every Saturday morning, Sharon could be found walking through the mall she now owned, greeting employees by name, stopping to chat with shoppers, making sure that everyone felt welcome. Her mother cried when Sharon gave her the emerald handbag and told her the full story. Baby, she said, wiping away tears, I didn't raise you to fight. But I'm so proud that you fight for what's right. You raised me to stand up for myself, Sharon replied. You taught me that my dignity isn't negotiable. Everything I did, I learned from watching you. 6 months after the incident, Sharon stood in front of a crowd of community leaders, business owners, and activists at a town hall meeting about retail discrimination. She shared her story, and then she shared something else. The stories of dozens of others who'd reached out to her after her experience went public. Stories of being followed in stores, of having security called on them for simply existing in spaces others didn't think they belonged. The question people keep asking me, Sharon said, is why I bought the mall. They want to know if it was revenge. And I tell them no. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. For too long we've been told that certain spaces aren't for us. That we need to prove our worth before we're allowed to exist in them. But I refuse to accept that narrative anymore. I bought that mall because I wanted to create a space where the next young black girl doesn't have to press her face against the window and dream. She can walk right in with her head held high, knowing she belongs there. Not because of what she can afford, but because of who she is, a human being deserving of dignity and respect. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sharon wasn't finished. Change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we demand it, when we refuse to accept the status quo, when we use whatever power we have, money, voice, platform, presence, to make the world more just. What happened to me happens every day to countless others. The only difference is that I had the resources to do something about it. But every single one of us has power. Every time you speak up when you witness injustice, every time you refuse to be silent, every time you support businesses and spaces that value all people equally, you're creating change. After the event, a young black teenager approached Sharon. She couldn't have been more than 15, with big dreams in her eyes and a notebook clutched in her hands. "Miss Matthews? I'm Maya. I want to be like you someday. I want to build something that matters." Sharon knelt down to look Maya in the eyes. "You already are like me. You have the same potential, the same worth, the same right to dream big. Don't let anyone make you small. Don't let anyone tell you where you do or don't belong. And when you face obstacles, and you will face them, remember that they're not a reflection of your worth. They're a reflection of other people's limitations. Before you go, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been treated unfairly because of who you are? What did you do about it? Drop your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and sharing these experiences helps create the change we need to see. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something important, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like Sharon's need to be told, and together we can amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Sharon's story didn't end that day at the mall. In many ways it was just beginning. She continued to use her platform and resources to fight against discrimination in all its forms. The Matthews Foundation, which she established with the profits from the mall, has since funded hundreds of minority-owned businesses, provided scholarships to thousands of students, and supported legislation to protect consumers from discriminatory practices. But perhaps more importantly, Sharon never forgot what it felt like to be dragged out of that mall, to be treated as less than human because of the color of her skin. That memory fueled her, driving her to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure the same humiliation. Years later, Sharon returned to that same Luminaire store, now completely renovated and managed by Jasmine, the young woman who'd witnessed the transformation firsthand. The emerald handbag that had started everything was now on display in a case, along with a plaque telling the story of what had happened and why change mattered. "We keep it there," Jasmine explained to curious shoppers, "as a reminder. A reminder that every person who walks through these doors deserves respect. A reminder that change is possible. And a reminder that sometimes, the people you underestimate are exactly the ones who will change your world." Sharon smiled, thinking about that scared 15-year-old girl who used to press her face against store windows, dreaming of a day when she'd belong. She'd come so far, fought so hard, and built so much. But the most important thing she'd built wasn't her company or her fortune. It was a legacy of dignity, of justice, of the radical idea that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human respect. As she walked through the mall that day, Sharon noticed something beautiful. People of all backgrounds, all ages, all walks of life, moving through the space with ease and comfort. Children laughing, families shopping together, teenagers hanging out by the fountain. This was what she'd fought for, not just her own right to be there, but everyone's right to exist in spaces without fear, without judgment, without having to constantly prove their worth. The little girl who dreamed through store windows had grown up to buy the entire building. But more than that, she transformed it into something better. A place where the next generation of dreamers could see themselves reflected, valued, and welcomed. And that, Sharon knew, was worth more than any amount of money could ever buy. It was worth the humiliation she'd endured, the fight she'd fought, the stand she'd taken. Because change doesn't come from staying silent. It comes from people who refuse to accept injustice, who use their voices and their power to make the world more fair, more just, more human. Sharon Matthews had walked into that mall as a customer and had been thrown out as a criminal. She'd walked back in as an owner, yes, but more importantly, she'd walked back in as a catalyst for change. And in doing so, she'd proven something essential. That dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something you carry within yourself, something you fight for, something you claim, no matter who tries to deny it. The question isn't whether you'll face injustice in this world. The question is what you'll do when you face it. Will you stay silent? Will you accept it? Or will you stand up, speak out, and fight for something better? Sharon chose to fight. And in fighting she changed everything. The transformation of Prestige Plaza became a blueprint that rippled far beyond Chicago. Within a year, Sharon found herself invited to speak at the National Retail Federation's annual conference. Standing before thousands of business leaders who controlled millions of square feet of retail space across America. But before that moment came another, quieter victory, one that meant just as much to Sharon if not more. 3 months after acquiring the mall, Sharon received a letter. It was handwritten, the penmanship shaky but deliberate. The return address showed it was from a women's correctional facility 2 states away. Sharon opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. "Dear Ms. Matthews," it began. "My name is Patricia Brooks. You don't know me, but I know your story. I'm writing from prison where I'm serving the 3rd year of a 5-year sentence for theft. But here's the thing, I didn't steal anything. I was accused of shoplifting from a department store just like you were. But unlike you, I couldn't afford a lawyer. I couldn't fight back. The store's security footage mysteriously malfunctioned that day, and it was my word against theirs. The prosecutor offered me a deal: plead guilty to a misdemeanor and get probation, or go to trial and risk years in prison if I lost. I was terrified. I took the deal. But then I violated probation by missing a court date when my daughter got sick, and here I am. Your story is the first time I felt seen. The first time I felt like maybe I wasn't crazy for knowing I didn't deserve what happened to me. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for winning. And please, if you can, help others like me who can't fight for themselves." Sharon read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Patricia's story was her story, could have been her story so easily. The only difference was resources, timing, and luck. That night, Sharon couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Patricia and about how many others like her were sitting in cells for crimes they didn't commit, punished not for what they'd done but for who they were and what they couldn't afford. By morning, Sharon had made another decision, one that would define the next chapter of her life. She called Jennifer Wu, her attorney. "Jennifer, I want to start a legal defense fund. Specifically for people who've been wrongly accused of theft due to racial profiling. I want to review cases, provide legal representation, and fight to overturn wrongful convictions." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Sharon, do you understand how big of an undertaking this is? These cases are complex, expensive, and emotionally draining. And the system doesn't like admitting when it's wrong." "I know," Sharon said. "That's exactly why we have to do it. Patricia Brooks is in prison right now for something she didn't do. How many more are there? Hundreds? Thousands?" "More than that," Jennifer admitted quietly. "But Sharon, this could take years. Decades. Then we better get started." The Matthews Justice Initiative launched 6 months later with a team of 15 attorneys, investigators, and advocates. Their mission was simple but revolutionary: identify cases where people had been convicted of retail theft based on racial profiling, inadequate defense, or prosecutorial misconduct, and fight to overturn those convictions. Patricia Brooks was their first client. Jennifer's team spent months reconstructing her case, interviewing witnesses the original defense attorney had never contacted, and discovering that the store had a documented history of falsely accusing black women of shoplifting. 3 other women came forward with similar stories about the same store. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly the store's malfunctioning security footage didn't seem like such a coincidence anymore. Sharon attended every court hearing for Patricia's case. She wanted Patricia to know she wasn't alone, that someone believed her, that her dignity mattered. On the day the judge overturned Patricia's conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective assistance of counsel, Patricia collapsed in tears. Sharon was there to catch her. "I got my life back," Patricia sobbed. "My daughter. I can see my daughter again. I can hold her." "You always deserved your life back," Sharon told her. "This was never about mercy or second chances. This was about justice, something that should have been yours from the beginning." But Patricia's victory was just one. The Matthews Justice Initiative quickly became overwhelmed with requests. Letters poured in from across the country. People sitting in jails and prisons, people with criminal records that destroyed their employment prospects, people who'd taken plea deals out of fear and desperation, even though they were innocent. Sharon realized she needed to scale the operation. She recruited more attorneys, partnered with law schools to create legal clinics, and developed technology to help identify potential cases of wrongful conviction. Her tech company built an AI system that could analyze retail theft cases and flag potential instances of racial profiling based on patterns in arrest records, security footage availability, and witness statements. The work was grueling and often heartbreaking. For every Patricia Brooks they could help, there were 10 more they couldn't reach in time. But slowly, steadily they were making a difference. By the end of the 2nd year, the Matthews Justice Initiative had overturned 43 wrongful convictions and secured settlements for dozens more who'd been falsely accused but not convicted. The retail industry wasn't happy. Several major chains sued Sharon, claiming her initiative was damaging their reputations. Sharon welcomed the lawsuits. They gave her legal discovery rights, which meant she could demand internal documents, training materials, and communications that revealed just how systemic the problem really was. What she found was shocking. Internal emails from one major retailer explicitly instructed security guards to pay special attention to Black and Latino shoppers. Training materials from another chain included coded language about high-risk demographics. Video after video showed security following people of color through stores while ignoring white shoppers who were actually stealing. Sharon released these findings at a press conference that made national headlines. Standing beside her were 23 people whose convictions had been overturned by her initiative, including Patricia, who'd become a full-time advocate for criminal justice reform. "This isn't about a few bad apples," Sharon told the packed room of reporters. "This is about a rotten system. A system that sees black and brown skin and automatically assumes criminality. A system that values merchandise over human dignity. A system that destroys lives over accusations that are often nothing more than prejudice in action." The backlash was intense. Sharon received death threats. Conservative commentators accused her of being anti-business and playing the race card. Some people even called for boycotts of her tech company. But something else happened too. The data she'd released sparked investigations in multiple states. Several retail chains were forced to pay multi-million-dollar settlements and implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Most importantly, the conversation had shifted. It was no longer acceptable to pretend that retail racial profiling didn't exist. The evidence was too overwhelming, the stories too numerous, the impact too devastating. Sharon's mother, watching all of this unfold, worried constantly about her daughter. "Baby, maybe you've done enough," she said one evening over dinner. "You've proven your point. You've helped so many people. But this fight, it's costing you. I see the exhaustion in your eyes. I see the toll it's taking." Sharon reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Mama, remember when I was 7 and those kids at school said I couldn't play in the sandbox because it was only for the good kids? Remember what you told me?" Her mother smiled through tears. "I told you that you were better than good. You were extraordinary. And that no one had the right to tell you where you could or couldn't be. And then you marched up to that school and raised hell until they changed their policies," Sharon continued. "You taught me that standing up for yourself isn't optional. It's essential. You fought for me my whole life, Mama. Let me fight for others now." The work continued. Sharon opened a second mall location under her ownership in Atlanta, implementing the same anti-discrimination policies and community investment programs. Then a third in Detroit. Each mall became a model for what retail spaces could be when they truly served their entire community. But Sharon's vision extended beyond retail. She began partnering with other industries, hotels, restaurants, financial institutions, helping them identify and eliminate discriminatory practices in their operations. The Matthews Equity Consulting Group became one of the most sought-after firms in the country, not because companies wanted to do the right thing, but because Sharon had proven that doing the right thing was also good business. The malls she owned were thriving, outperforming competitors specifically because they'd built trust with communities that other retailers had alienated. 5 years after that day at Prestige Plaza, Sharon stood in front of Congress, testifying in support of the Retail Justice Act, legislation that would ban racial profiling in retail environments and create a federal system for reporting and investigating discriminatory practices. The bill had bipartisan support, something almost unheard of in the current political climate. "I'm here today not as a CEO or a philanthropist," Sharon told the assembled lawmakers, "but as someone who knows what it feels like to be judged not by the content of my character, but by the color of my skin. I'm here as someone who was dragged out of a mall like a criminal for the crime of shopping while black. But I'm also here representing the hundreds of people whose lives have been destroyed by a system that sees them as threats rather than customers, as suspects rather than human beings." She paused, looking around the room. Some lawmakers were nodding. Others looked uncomfortable. Good, Sharon thought. They should be uncomfortable. "The question before you isn't complicated," she continued. "It's actually very simple. Do black lives, black dignity, black humanity matter in retail spaces? Do they matter in our society? Because every time a black person is followed through a store, accused without evidence, arrested without cause, or convicted without justice, our answer as a society is no. They don't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you that we matter. And I'm here to demand that you pass legislation that finally, officially recognizes that truth." The Retail Justice Act passed 4 months later. It wasn't perfect. Compromises had been made, enforcement mechanisms weren't as strong as Sharon had wanted, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress. On the day the president signed the bill into law, Sharon was invited to attend the ceremony. She brought Patricia Brooks with her. They stood in the White House, watching history being made, knowing that their pain had been transformed into something meaningful. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Patricia asked Sharon quietly. "That day at the mall, I mean. Do you ever wish you could go back and just skip that whole experience?" Sharon thought about the question carefully. 5 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. The humiliation, the pain, the anger, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But now? She paused, watching the president sign his name on the document that would change lives. "Now I understand that sometimes our worst moments become the catalyst for our greatest purpose. I didn't ask to be dragged out of that mall. But I can choose what to do with that experience. I can let it break me or I can let it build something better." Patricia nodded. "You built something incredible. You gave me my life back. You gave hundreds of people their lives back." "We gave them what they always deserved," Sharon corrected. "That's the thing people don't understand. This isn't about me being generous or charitable. This is about demanding that everyone receives the basic dignity and justice that should never have been taken from them in the first place." The ceremony ended, and Sharon and Patricia walked out of the White House together. Outside, a group of advocates and formerly incarcerated people who'd been helped by the Matthews Justice Initiative were waiting. When they saw Sharon, they erupted in cheers. Someone had brought signs, "Sharon Matthews changed my life," and "Justice for all, not just some." Sharon felt overwhelmed by emotion. This journey had started with her being dragged out of a mall, humiliated and hurt. And now, here she was, surrounded by people whose lives had been transformed because she'd refused to stay silent. Because she'd chosen to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. That night, Sharon returned to her hotel room and finally allowed herself to rest. She thought about that young girl who'd pressed her face against store windows, dreaming of a day when she'd belong. She thought about her mother, who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities. She thought about Miranda and Stephen, whose prejudice had inadvertently sparked a movement. She thought about Patricia and the hundreds of others like her, whose stories would now be heard, whose lives would now have a second chance. And she thought about the future, about young black girls and boys who would grow up in a world that was slightly more fair because people had been willing to stand up and demand change. Sharon picked up her phone and called her mother. "Mama? I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. For teaching me to stand up. For teaching me to fight. For teaching me that my dignity isn't negotiable." Her mother's voice was warm and proud. "Baby, I didn't teach you those things. You already had them inside you. I just made sure nobody could take them away." "Well, I'm making sure nobody can take them away from anyone else either," Sharon said. "I know, baby. I know. And I've never been more proud." After they hung up, Sharon walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Washington, D.C. sprawled before her, the seat of power, the place where laws were made and histories were written. She'd just witnessed a law being signed that would protect millions of people from the kind of discrimination she'd faced. But she also knew that laws alone weren't enough. Real change required hearts and minds to shift, required people to see each other's humanity, required a fundamental transformation in how society valued, or devalued, black and brown lives. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished, not in her lifetime. But every life changed, every conviction overturned, every policy reformed. These were victories worth celebrating. These were steps toward the world she wanted to see. Sharon thought back to that moment on the sidewalk outside Prestige Plaza, her wrists red from zip ties, her spirit wounded but not broken. She'd made a choice in that moment, to fight back, to demand justice, to use her resources and platform to create change. And that choice had rippled outward in ways she never could have imagined. The little girl who'd dreamed through store windows had indeed bought the entire mall. But more than that, she'd helped build a world where the next generation wouldn't have to press their faces against the glass. They could walk right through the doors with their heads held high, knowing they belonged. And that, Sharon knew with absolute certainty, was the truest form of victory. Years from now, people would ask Sharon about that day at the mall. They'd want to know how it felt, what she was thinking, whether she knew then that it would lead to all of this. And Sharon would tell them the truth, that she'd been terrified and angry and hurt. That she'd wanted to disappear, to forget, to pretend it never happened. But she'd also tell them something else, that sometimes our greatest power comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into purpose. That dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away, it's something you claim for yourself and defend for others. That justice isn't a destination but a journey, and every person who joins that journey makes it a little bit easier for those who come after. Sharon Matthews had been dragged out of a mall as if she were worthless. She'd walked back in and proved that her worth, and the worth of everyone who looked like her, was infinite, undeniable, and worth fighting for. And she was just getting started. The morning after the White House ceremony, Sharon woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Something had happened overnight, something that would test everything she'd built in ways she never anticipated. A video had gone viral. Shot on someone's phone at a Target in Phoenix, it showed a 17-year-old black boy named Marcus Webb being tackled to the ground by store security. The teenager was crying, screaming that he hadn't done anything wrong, while shoppers stood by recording but not intervening. The security guard's knee was pressed into Marcus's back, eerily reminiscent of images that had sparked national protests years before. The caption on the video read, "This is still happening. Sharon Matthews changed the law but not the culture. When will it end?" Sharon watched the video 3 times, her hands trembling. Marcus looked so young, so terrified. She could see herself in him, could see every black child who'd ever been treated like a threat simply for existing. The video had been viewed 20 million times in 8 hours. The comment sections were exploding. Some people demanding justice, others defending the security guard, claiming Marcus must have done something to deserve it. Sharon made a decision. She called her assistant. "Cancel everything today. Book me a flight to Phoenix. And get me in touch with Marcus Webb's family. Now." 6 hours later, Sharon was sitting in the living room of the Webb family's modest home in a Phoenix suburb. Marcus's mother, Denise, was a nurse who worked double shifts to support her 3 children. Marcus's father had died 2 years earlier from complications of diabetes. Complications he might have survived if he'd had better health care, Denise explained quietly. Marcus himself was in his room, refusing to come out. The video had been shared at his school. Kids were making memes, jokes. Some called him a criminal. Others said he should have just complied. At 17, Marcus was learning a brutal lesson about how the world saw him. He was buying school supplies, Denise told Sharon, tears streaming down her face. Notebooks and pens for the new semester. He had the money in his hand. "The receipt is right here." She held up a crumpled piece of paper. But the security guard said he saw Marcus put something in his backpack. Said he was acting suspicious. Marcus tried to show him the backpack, tried to explain, but the guard wouldn't listen. Just grabbed him and threw him down. Sharon felt rage building in her chest, the same rage she'd felt 5 years ago. But she'd learned to channel that rage, to transform it into something productive. "Has anyone from Target reached out to you?" Denise laughed bitterly. "Oh yes. They offered us a $200 gift card and asked us to sign something saying we wouldn't sue. Like my son's dignity is worth $200. "Don't sign anything," Sharon said firmly. "Jennifer Wu, my attorney, will be here tomorrow. We're going to handle this, Denise. But more than that, I need to talk to Marcus. Would that be okay?" Denise nodded and went to get her son. When Marcus finally emerged, Sharon's heart broke. He wouldn't make eye contact, his shoulders were hunched, and she could see the weight of humiliation crushing him. This was what systemic racism did. It took bright, beautiful young people and taught them to hate themselves, to see themselves as problems rather than promises. "Marcus," Sharon said gently, "my name is Sharon Matthews. 5 years ago, something similar happened to me. I was dragged out of a mall and accused of stealing. And I want you to know something really important. What happened to you was not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. The security guard who tackled you was wrong. The system that taught him to see you as a threat was wrong. But you're not wrong. You're not a criminal. You're not suspicious. You're a kid buying school supplies, which is exactly what you should be doing." Marcus looked up at her for the first time, and Sharon saw his eyes were red from crying. "But everyone saw the video. Everyone thinks I'm a thief. They're saying..." His voice broke. "They're saying maybe I did do something. That maybe I was stealing and just got caught. How do I prove I didn't? How do I make people believe me?" Sharon moved to sit beside him. "Here's what I've learned, Marcus. You can't control what other people think or believe. Some people are going to assume the worst about you no matter what you do, no matter how much evidence proves them wrong. But here's what you can control. You can decide who you are. You can decide what you stand for. And you can decide whether this thing that happened to you becomes the end of your story or just one chapter in a much bigger book." "I don't want to be the kid from that video," Marcus whispered. "Then don't be," Sharon said. "Be the kid who survived that video. Be the kid who stood up afterward. Be the kid who used his voice to make sure this doesn't happen to the next person. I'm not saying it'll be easy. It won't be. But you have a choice, Marcus. You always have a choice." Over the next few weeks, Sharon worked with the Webb family to not only sue Target but to launch something bigger. Marcus, with Sharon's support and guidance, started a youth advocacy organization called We Belong Here, a platform for young people of color who'd experienced racial profiling to share their stories and demand change. The organization's first action was a peaceful protest at the Phoenix Target where Marcus had been tackled. Hundreds of young people showed up, carrying signs that read "Shopping while black is not a crime," and "We are not your threats." Marcus, standing on a makeshift stage with Sharon beside him, addressed the crowd with a voice that shook but didn't break. "I was scared to come here today," Marcus admitted. "I was scared people would laugh at me or call me names or say I deserved what happened. But then I realized something. If I stay silent, if I hide, I'm letting them win. I'm letting them convince me that I don't belong in stores, in schools, in spaces where I have every right to be. And I refuse to do that. We refuse to do that." The crowd erupted in cheers. Sharon watched Marcus transform before her eyes, from a traumatized teenager to a powerful advocate. This was what healing looked like, she realized. Not forgetting the pain but refusing to let it define you. Target's response to the protest was initially defensive. Corporate issued a statement saying the security guard had followed protocol, and that they were committed to serving all customers. But Sharon had learned from her experience with Prestige Plaza. She didn't just attack Target publicly, she bought stock in the company. Enough stock to gain a seat at shareholder meetings. Enough stock to have a voice that corporate couldn't ignore. At the next shareholder meeting, Sharon stood up during the public comment period. "I'm Sharon Matthews and I own approximately 2% of this company, which makes me one of your larger individual shareholders. I'm here to tell you that your current security protocols are not just morally wrong, they're bad business. The African American community has a combined buying power of over $1 trillion annually. How much of that market share do you think Target will retain when black families know their children aren't safe in your stores?" She pulled out her phone and projected images onto the screen behind her. Photos of empty Target stores in predominantly black neighborhoods, screenshots of social media campaigns calling for boycotts, and most damning of all, Target's own sales data showing a 15% decline in stores serving minority communities since the Marcus Webb video went viral. "You're losing money because you're losing trust," Sharon continued. "And you're losing trust because your policies treat people of color like criminals by default. I'm proposing a comprehensive reform package. Mandatory de-escalation training for all security personnel, body cameras on all security staff, an independent review board to investigate complaints of racial profiling, and a community investment fund to support organizations addressing retail discrimination. Implement these changes or watch your market share continue to plummet while your competitors figure out what you refuse to acknowledge, that treating all customers with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's profitable." The room was silent. Then one shareholder started clapping. Then another. Within moments, half the room was applauding while the other half sat in stunned silence. Target CEO looked like he wanted to disappear. 3 months later, Target announced sweeping changes to their security protocols, citing Sharon's proposals almost word for word. They also settled with the Webb family for an undisclosed amount, though Sharon made sure it was substantial enough to pay for Marcus's college education and provide financial security for his family. But victory in one battle didn't mean the war was over. Reports continued to flood in from across the country, from shopping malls, grocery stores, department stores, boutiques. Sharon's team at the Matthews Justice Initiative was overwhelmed with cases. They were making progress, yes, but it felt like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. Sharon was exhausted. She'd been fighting for 6 years straight and the weight of it was crushing. She'd poured millions of her own money into the cause. She'd sacrificed relationships, sleep, peace of mind. And still, videos like Marcus's kept emerging. Still, black people kept being profiled, arrested, convicted, and imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. One night, Sharon broke down. She was alone in her office at midnight, reviewing case files, when suddenly the tears came. Not quiet tears, loud, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. All the pain she'd been holding, all the stories she'd heard, all the lives she couldn't save, it all came crashing down at once. Her phone rang. It was her mother, as if she'd sensed Sharon needed her. "Baby, I know that sound," her mother said. "You're carrying too much." "Mama, I can't stop," Sharon said through her tears. "Every time I think about stepping back, I get another letter from someone in prison who shouldn't be there. Another video of someone being brutalized. Another story that breaks my heart. How do I stop when people are suffering?" "You don't stop," her mother said gently. "But you do rest. You do ask for help. You do remember that you're human, and no human can carry the weight of the entire world alone. Sharon, you've done something incredible. You've changed laws, freed people from prison, transformed an entire industry's practices. But you can't save everyone, baby. And trying to will destroy you. Then what do I do? Sharon asked, feeling lost for the first time since this journey began. You build something that outlasts you, her mother said. You create systems and organizations that will continue this work long after you're gone. You train the next generation of fighters. You document everything you've learned so others can learn from it. You plant trees whose shade you'll never sit under. That's how you win a war that can't be won in one lifetime. Those words changed Sharon's perspective. She realized her mother was right. She'd been treating this like a sprint when it was a marathon. No, it was more than a marathon. It was a relay race, and she needed to start passing the baton. Sharon began restructuring her organizations with succession in mind. She hired and mentored younger leaders, particularly young people of color who'd lived through the experiences she was fighting against. Marcus Webb became a youth advisor for the Matthews Justice Initiative. Patricia Brooks, who'd gotten her degree in social work after her conviction was overturned, became the director of victim advocacy services. Sharon also started saying no. Not to the work, but to the expectation that she had to be everywhere, do everything, solve every problem. She learned to delegate, to trust her team, to preserve her own energy and mental health so she could sustain the long-term fight. And she learned to celebrate the small victories. Every time a case was won, every time a policy was changed, every time someone's dignity was restored, these weren't just steps toward a distant goal. They were victories in themselves, worthy of recognition and joy. On the 10th anniversary of the Prestige Plaza incident, Sharon organized a massive event she called the Dignity Summit. Thousands of people gathered: activists, formerly incarcerated people, retail workers, community organizers, students, and families who'd been impacted by racial profiling. Sharon stood on stage, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. 10 years ago, Sharon began, I was dragged out of a shopping mall for the crime of existing while black. I was humiliated, traumatized, and angry. But I was also lucky to have resources, education, and support that allowed me to fight back. Most people don't have that luck. Most people just have to swallow the humiliation and move on with their lives, carrying the weight of injustice with no outlet, no recourse, no justice. So I made a choice. I chose to fight not just for myself, but for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. And in these 10 years, we've accomplished things I never thought possible. We've overturned 417 wrongful convictions. We've changed federal law. We've transformed corporate policies at dozens of major retailers. We've trained over 50,000 retail workers in anti-bias practices. We've created a network of youth advocates who are demanding change in their communities. But here's what I've learned. Real change doesn't come from one person or one organization. It comes from movements. It comes from all of us deciding that we're done accepting a world where people are judged by their skin color instead of their character. Where shopping, driving, walking, breathing while black is treated as inherently suspicious. Where black bodies are seen as threats rather than human beings. I can't change that world by myself. But we can change it together. The crowd roared with approval. Sharon felt her mother's hand slip into hers. Her mother had joined her on stage, the woman who'd started it all by teaching a little girl that she deserved dignity. After the summit, as Sharon was preparing to leave, a young girl approached her. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with her hair in neat braids and big brown eyes full of wonder. Are you Miss Sharon? The little girl asked. I am, Sharon said, kneeling down to the girl's level. My teacher told us about you. She said you bought a whole mall because they were mean to you. Sharon smiled. That's part of the story, yes. The little girl thought about this for a moment. When I grow up, if someone's mean to me because I'm black, can I buy their building too? Sharon's heart swelled. She pulled the little girl into a gentle hug. Baby, you can do whatever you set your mind to. But here's what I want you to remember. You don't need to buy a building to have power. Your voice is power. Your dignity is power. The fact that you exist and deserve respect, that's power. Don't let anyone ever make you forget that. The little girl nodded seriously, processing this wisdom. Then she said something that nearly broke Sharon. Thank you for fighting so that when I'm big, maybe people won't be as mean. After the girl left with her parents, Sharon sat alone for a long moment. That little girl represented everything Sharon was fighting for. A future where black children could simply be children, where they could shop and play and dream without the weight of systemic racism crushing them before they even had a chance to spread their wings. The work would continue. There would be more battles, more setbacks, more moments of despair. But there would also be more victories, more lives changed, more steps toward justice. Sharon thought about that moment 10 years ago when she'd stood on the sidewalk outside Prestige Plaza, humiliated and angry, making phone calls that would change her life. She thought about every person she'd helped since then, every system she'd challenged, every mind she'd changed. And she realized something profound. She hadn't just bought 'em all that day. She'd bought her power back. She'd reclaimed her dignity. And in doing so, she'd helped countless others reclaim theirs. The little girl who'd pressed her face against store windows had grown into a woman who broke down walls. And she wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Because dignity isn't something you buy or sell. It's something you fight for, every single day until everyone, can walk through any door with their head held high knowing they belong. And that fight, Sharon knew with absolute certainty, was worth dedicating her entire life to. The story of Sharon Matthews didn't end at Prestige Plaza. It began there. And it would continue through her work, through the people she'd inspired, through the systems she'd changed, and through every person who refused to accept a world that treated human beings as less than human. That was the real victory. Not buying 'em all but building a movement. Not defeating her enemies but transforming a system. Not seeking revenge but demanding justice. And in the end, justice, real, lasting, transformative justice, was the only thing worth fighting for. The years continued to unfold, and Sharon's work evolved in ways even she hadn't anticipated. By year 12, the Matthews Justice Initiative had expanded internationally. A case in London, a Nigerian woman named Chioma Okafor who'd been falsely accused of theft at Harrods, caught Sharon's attention. The parallels were uncanny. The dismissive treatment, the false accusations, the public humiliation. But Chioma didn't have resources to fight back. She'd lost her job because of the arrest record. Her visa status was in jeopardy. She was on the verge of deportation. Sharon flew to London herself. She met Chioma in a cramped legal aid office, and saw in this woman's eyes the same mix of anger, fear, and exhaustion she'd felt all those years ago. "Why are you here?" Chioma asked, suspicious of this wealthy American who'd appeared out of nowhere. "What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," Sharon said quietly. "I'm here because 12 years ago I was you. And someone needs to tell you what I wish someone had told me in that moment. This isn't the end of your story. It's just a chapter. And we're going to write the next one together." The Harrods case became a landmark in UK retail law. Sharon partnered with British civil rights organizations, and together they not only cleared Chioma's name but pushed for legislative changes similar to the Retail Justice Act in the United States. The movement was spreading, crossing borders, becoming global. But with growth came new challenges. Not everyone celebrated Sharon's work. She'd made powerful enemies. Retail corporations who resented her interference, politicians who accused her of being divisive, media personalities who questioned her motives. The attacks became more personal, more vicious. A conservative news network ran a week-long series questioning where Sharon's money came from, insinuating financial impropriety without evidence. Social media trolls created fake accounts claiming to be victims of Sharon's agenda. Someone even filed a frivolous lawsuit claiming Sharon's anti-bias training programs were reverse discrimination. The lowest point came when Sharon's mother's house was vandalized. Someone spray-painted racial slurs across the front door and left a note, "Tell your daughter to stop destroying America." Sharon found her mother sitting calmly on the front porch when she arrived, a cup of tea in her hands, looking at the hateful words like they were merely an inconvenience. "Mama, I'm so sorry," Sharon said, tears streaming down her face. "This is my fault. I brought this to your doorstep." Her mother set down her tea and looked at Sharon with fierce eyes. "Baby, don't you dare apologize for standing up for what's right. These people who did this, they're scared. They're scared because you're winning. They're scared because the world they knew, the world where they could treat people like us as less than human without consequences, that world is crumbling. And when scared people can't fight your ideas, they attack you personally. It means you're doing something right. But what if something happens to you because of me?" Sharon asked, her voice breaking. "Then I'll die knowing my daughter changed the world," her mother said simply. "Sharon, I didn't raise you to play it safe. I raised you to fight. And sometimes fighting comes with a cost. But you know what costs more? Silence. Acceptance. Teaching the next generation that injustice is just the way things are. That costs everything." Sharon hired security for her mother's house. She also used the vandalism as a teaching moment, posting photos of it on social media alongside a message. "This is what desperation looks like. When you can't defeat someone's ideas, you attack their family. When you can't justify your position, you resort to hate. But here's what these cowards don't understand. Every act of hate against us only strengthens our resolve. Every slur only proves why this work matters. Every attempt to silence us only amplifies our voices. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down. We will not stop fighting until justice isn't just an ideal but a reality for everyone. The post went viral. Thousands of people shared it, added their own stories of harassment and intimidation for standing up against injustice. The news network that had been attacking Sharon was forced to condemn the vandalism, though they never apologized for their role in creating the climate that enabled it. But something else happened too. Donations to the Matthews Justice Initiative tripled overnight. Volunteers flooded their offices. Letters poured in from people around the world, sharing their own experiences and pledging support. The attack that was meant to weaken the movement had instead strengthened it. Sharon realized something crucial. Movements don't grow in comfort. They grow in adversity. Every attack, every setback, every moment of darkness was an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, to show that the fight for justice couldn't be intimidated into silence. Around this time, Sharon received an unexpected invitation. The White House wanted her to serve on a presidential commission studying racial equity in commerce. It was a prestigious appointment, a recognition of everything she'd accomplished. But Sharon was wary. She'd seen too many activists get co-opted by systems of power, their radical visions diluted into comfortable reforms that changed little. She accepted the appointment but on her own terms. "I'll serve on this commission," she told the White House aide who'd extended the invitation, "but I won't be a token. I won't be there to make you look progressive while real change gets blocked behind closed doors. If I'm on this commission, I'm going to push for real transformation, not just cosmetic changes. If that makes people uncomfortable, good. Comfort is the enemy of progress." The commission work was exhausting and often frustrating. Sharon found herself in rooms with people who spoke eloquently about racial justice but balked at any proposals that threatened existing power structures. She watched as bold recommendations got watered down, as urgent calls for action became suggestions for further study. But Sharon had learned patience. She built alliances with other commissioners who actually wanted change. She documented every compromise, every pushback, every moment when political calculation trumped moral imperative. And when the commission's final report was released, a document she thought was far too timid, she released her own dissenting opinion, outlining what real equity would require and why the commission's recommendations fell short. Her dissent generated more attention than the official report. News outlets picked it up. Activists used it as a blueprint for organizing. Politicians who'd hoped the commission would quiet calls for change found instead that it had energized them. "You were supposed to help us find consensus," one frustrated White House official told Sharon. "I was supposed to help you find justice," Sharon corrected. "If those two things aren't the same, that's not my problem. That's yours." By year 15, Sharon had become a polarizing figure. Some people saw her as a hero, a warrior for justice who refused to compromise her principles. Others saw her as divisive, someone who stirred up conflict rather than seeking harmony. Sharon had made peace with this reality. She'd learned that in a world built on injustice, calls for justice would always be seen as divisive by those who benefited from the status quo. But she'd also learned something else: she wasn't alone. The movement she'd helped spark had taken on a life of its own. Young activists were doing work she'd never dreamed of, using technology to track retail profiling in real time, creating community-based alternatives to traditional security, building coalitions across racial and ethnic lines. They didn't need Sharon to lead them. They were leading themselves. Marcus Webb, now 27, had become a prominent civil rights attorney. He'd taken the trauma of that day in Target and transformed it into a career fighting for others. He'd successfully argued cases before federal courts, establishing precedents that protected people from discriminatory policing in retail spaces. Patricia Brooks had written a best-selling memoir about her wrongful conviction and redemption. The book's success had led to a documentary, which had led to a speaking career. She now traveled the country telling her story, putting a human face on the abstract concept of wrongful conviction. Chioma Okafor had started her own organization in London, modeled after Sharon's initiative, helping African immigrants who faced discrimination in European retail spaces. These weren't people Sharon had saved. They were people she'd empowered to save themselves and others. That, she realized, was the true measure of success. Not what you accomplish yourself but what you enable others to accomplish. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Sharon was working in her office when her assistant buzzed her. "There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Her name is Miranda Walsh. Sharon's blood ran cold. Miranda Walsh. The woman who'd falsely accused her at Luminaire 15 years ago. The woman whose actions had set all of this in motion. Sharon's first instinct was to refuse the meeting, to turn away the person who'd hurt her. But curiosity won out. Send her in. Miranda looked different. Older, obviously, 15 years had passed. But more than that, she looked smaller somehow, diminished. The confident cruelty Sharon remembered was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. They sat in silence for a long moment, two women whose lives had been irrevocably connected by one terrible day. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Miranda finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I deserve to be here. But I had to come. I had to tell you. I'm sorry. For what I did to you. For who I was. For the harm I caused." Sharon studied her carefully. "Why now? Why, after 15 years, do you suddenly feel the need to apologize?" Miranda's eyes filled with tears. "Because I finally understand what I did to you. After you fired me from Luminaire, I couldn't find work in retail. No one would hire me, your story had made national news, and I was the villain. I was angry at first. I thought I was the victim. I told myself you'd ruin my life. But then..." She paused, wiping her eyes. "Then I got a job as a cashier at a grocery store in a different state. And one day I watched a black teenager come in, and I saw how my coworker followed him around the store. How she watched his every move. How she called security even though he was just shopping. And I saw myself. I saw what I'd done to you. And I was horrified." Sharon listened without interruption. "I started paying attention after that," Miranda continued. "I saw how people like me, white people, moved through stores without being watched, without being questioned, without having to prove we belonged. And I saw how people who looked like you were treated like criminals just for existing. I saw the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion, the anger. And I realized I'd spent my whole life contributing to that. I'd spent my whole life making people feel less than human because of their skin color. And I was ashamed." "What do you want from me, Miranda?" Sharon asked, her voice neutral. "Nothing," Miranda said quickly. "I don't want forgiveness or absolution. I don't deserve that. I just wanted you to know that what you've built, the Matthews Justice Initiative, the laws you've changed, the lives you've saved, it didn't just help the people you intended to help. It helped me too. It helped me see myself clearly for the first time. It helped me understand the harm I'd caused. And I've spent the last 5 years trying to make amends. I volunteer with organizations fighting retail discrimination. I speak at trainings about my experience, about how ordinary racism looks and feels. I teach people how not to be who I was." Sharon took a deep breath. Part of her wanted to send Miranda away, to tell her that her belated realization didn't undo the harm she'd caused. But another part of her, the part that had been fighting for 15 years to create a world where people could change, could grow, could become better, that part recognized something important in this moment. "I appreciate you telling me this," Sharon said carefully. "And I'm glad you've changed. But you need to understand something, Miranda. Your apology doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't undo the trauma or the pain. What it does is show that people can evolve. That even people who've caused serious harm can recognize that harm and commit to doing better. That's important. Not for me, but for everyone who's watching this movement and wondering if change is really possible." Miranda nodded, more tears falling. "I know. And I know I can never make up for what I did to you. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure I don't do it to anyone else. And maybe if I'm lucky, I can help other people see what I couldn't see before." After Miranda left, Sharon sat alone in her office for a long time, processing the encounter. She thought about the 16-year-old version of herself who'd been dragged out of that mall, humiliated and angry. If someone had told that version of Sharon that one day Miranda would come to her, genuinely changed and apologetic, would she have believed it? Probably not. But that was the thing about fighting for justice over the long term, you started to see changes you never imagined possible. Not just in systems and laws but in people's hearts and minds. Sharon called her mother that evening and told her about Miranda's visit. "How do you feel about it?" her mother asked. "Honestly, I'm not sure," Sharon admitted. "Part of me is angry that it took her 15 years to understand what she did. Part of me wonders if her change is genuine or if it's just guilt. But another part of me thinks that if Miranda can change, really change, then anyone can. And maybe that's the most hopeful thing I've experienced in this whole journey." "Do you forgive her?" her mother asked. Sharon thought about this carefully. "I don't know if forgiveness is even the right framework. What she did was wrong. That doesn't change just because she's sorry now. But I can acknowledge her growth without erasing the harm. I can recognize her transformation without absolving her responsibility. That feels more honest than either complete forgiveness or complete condemnation. That's wisdom, baby, her mother said. That's the kind of nuanced thinking we need more of. That night, Sharon couldn't sleep. She found herself thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by that day at Prestige Plaza 15 years ago. The hundreds of people freed from wrongful convictions. The thousands who'd been trained in anti-bias practices. The millions who'd watched the movement grow and been inspired to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Even Miranda transformed from perpetrator to advocate. One terrible day had sparked all of this. One moment of injustice had led to a movement that changed laws, freed the innocent, and challenged systems that had oppressed people for generations. Sharon thought about that 8-year-old girl at the Dignity Summit who'd asked if she could buy a building too when she grew up. That little girl would grow up in a world slightly more just than the one Sharon had inherited. Not perfect, far from it, but better. Measurably better. And when that little girl faced her own moments of injustice, and she would, because the work was far from finished, she'd have tools, frameworks, and movements that Sharon's generation had built. She'd have examples of people who'd fought and won. She'd have proof that change was possible. That was the real legacy. Not the malls Sharon owned or the money she'd made or even the laws she'd changed. The real legacy was the foundation she'd laid for the next generation of fighters. The knowledge she'd passed down. The courage she'd modeled. The proof that dignity was worth fighting for no matter the cost. Sharon finally fell asleep that night with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The work would continue, it would always continue. But she'd done what she set out to do. She'd transformed her pain into purpose. She'd used her resources to lift others up. She'd refused to let injustice have the last word. The little girl who'd pressed her face against store windows had grown into a woman who ensured that the next generation wouldn't have to press their faces against anything. They could walk through any door, heads held high, knowing they belonged. And that knowledge, that unshakable certainty that they deserved dignity, respect, and justice, would be the foundation upon which they'd build an even better world. Sharon Matthews had been dragged out of a mall as if she were worthless. She'd walked back in and bought the building. But more than that, she built a movement, changed a culture, and transformed countless lives. And 15 years later, as she drifted off to sleep, Sharon knew with absolute certainty that the fight had been worth it. Every tear, every setback, every moment of despair, all of it had led to something bigger than herself. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And Sharon had spent 15 years ensuring that the path would be a little easier for those who came after her. That was enough. That was everything. And the story continued, carried forward by all the people she'd touched, all the systems she'd changed, all the minds she'd opened, and all the hearts she'd inspired. The work was far from finished. But Sharon Matthews had proven something essential. That one person standing up against injustice, refusing to be silenced, insisting on dignity, one person could change the world. Not alone. Never alone. But one person could start the fire that warmed a generation. And that fire was still burning bright. 20 years had passed since that day at Prestige Plaza Mall. Sharon Matthews stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in her Chicago office, looking out at the city she'd called home her entire life. At 50 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd fought countless battles and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. Her natural hair, now streaked with silver, was worn in locks that fell past her shoulders, a deliberate choice she'd made 5 years ago, reclaiming another piece of herself that the corporate world had once told her to hide. Her assistant knocked softly on the door. "Miss Matthews, they're ready for you." Sharon took a deep breath, picked up the folder on her desk, and walked toward what would be one of the most important meetings of her life. The conference room was filled with faces both familiar and new. Marcus Webb, now a federal judge, the youngest in the circuit's history. Patricia Brooks, whose advocacy organization had helped over 10,000 formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. Chioma Okafor, joining via video from London, where she'd just been appointed to the UK's Equality Commission. And dozens of others, activists, attorneys, organizers, and advocates who'd been shaped by the movement Sharon had helped spark 2 decades ago. But there were also new faces. Young people in their 20s and 30s who'd grown up hearing Sharon's story, who'd been inspired by it, and who were now leading the next wave of change. "Thank you all for coming," Sharon began, her voice steady. 20 years ago, I was dragged out of a shopping mall and accused of being a thief. That moment changed my life. It led me to build the Matthews Justice Initiative, to fight for legislative change, to demand dignity and justice for people who'd been denied both. And together, all of us in this room and thousands more around the world, we've accomplished things I never dreamed possible. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who'd become her family in this fight. We've overturned over 800 wrongful convictions. We've changed federal law in the United States and influenced legislation in 17 other countries. We've trained over 200,000 retail workers in anti-bias practices. We've created a generation of advocates who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. We've proven that change, real change, is possible. Sharon opened the folder in her hands. But I didn't call you here to celebrate what we've done. I called you here to talk about what comes next. Because today, I'm announcing that I'm stepping down as CEO of the Matthews Justice Initiative. A murmur rippled through the room. Several people started to protest, but Sharon raised her hand gently. Please hear me out. I'm not abandoning this work. I'm transitioning it. For 20 years, I've poured everything I have into this fight. And it's been the most meaningful work of my life. But I've also learned something important. Movements can't be built around one person. They have to be bigger than any individual. They have to be sustainable beyond any single leader's lifetime. She smiled, looking at the young faces in the room. When I started this journey, I thought I needed to be the one solving every problem, fighting every battle. But what I've realized is that my job isn't to be the hero of this story forever. My job is to build something that doesn't need me. To create systems and train leaders who can carry this work forward long after I'm gone. Sharon gestured to a young black woman sitting near the front. Aaliyah James, 32 years old, who joined the organization 6 years ago and had quickly become one of its most brilliant strategists. Aaliyah will be taking over as CEO of the Matthews Justice Initiative. She's been instrumental in our most successful campaigns over the past 5 years. She understands both the history of this movement and the future it needs to move toward. And most importantly, she's not me. She'll bring fresh perspectives, new strategies, and the energy this work requires. Aaliyah looked stunned, tears streaming down her face. Miss Matthews, I don't know if I can fill your shoes. Sharon walked over and took Aaliyah's hands in hers. You're not supposed to fill my shoes. You're supposed to walk your own path. I'll be here as an advisor, as a supporter, as someone you can call when you need guidance. But this is your movement now. Yours and everyone else's in this room who's ready to keep fighting. Over the next hour, Sharon outlined her transition plan. She'd remain on the board, continue to fund the organization, and be available for major strategic decisions. But the day-to-day leadership, the public face of the movement, the direction it took, that would now be in the hands of the next generation. I'm not retiring, Sharon clarified as the meeting wound down. I'm just shifting my focus. There are other battles to fight, other ways to contribute. My mother is 78 now, and I want to spend more time with her while I can. I want to write a book documenting everything we've learned so that future activists don't have to reinvent the wheel. I want to teach, to mentor, to support the next wave of changemakers without being at the center of everything. I want to live, not just fight. After the meeting, Sharon found herself alone with Marcus, Patricia, and Chioma, her oldest allies in this journey. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked. This movement is your legacy. No, Sharon corrected gently. This movement is our legacy. All of ours. And it will outlive all of us. That's how you know you've built something real, when it doesn't need you anymore. Patricia laughed through tears. 20 years ago I was in prison, convinced my life was over. Now I'm sitting here, part of something that's changed the world. And it all started because you refused to accept injustice. It started because we refused to accept injustice, Sharon said. I was just the spark. You all were the fire. That evening Sharon drove to her mother's house. The home had been renovated several times over the years, made comfortable and secure. But her mother had refused to move to a wealthier neighborhood, insisting she belonged exactly where she'd always been, among the community that had raised her and her daughter. They sat together on the porch, the same porch where her mother had calmly sipped tea after it had been vandalized with hate speech years before. The street was quiet, the Chicago summer evening warm and peaceful. I stepped down today, Sharon said. From the initiative. Her mother nodded, unsurprised. How does it feel? Terrifying, Sharon admitted. For 20 years that work has been who I am. I don't know who I am without it. Her mother took Sharon's hand the same way she'd done countless times throughout Sharon's life, when she was a little girl crying about kids who said she didn't belong, when she was a teenager facing discrimination at school, when she was a young woman building a business, when she was dragged out of that mall 2 decades ago. Baby, that work isn't who you are. It's what you did with who you are. You're still the same girl who pressed her face against store windows and dreamed of a better world. You're still the woman who refused to let anyone make her small. The work changes but you're still you. I don't know what comes next, Mama. Good, her mother said, smiling. If you knew what came next, it wouldn't be an adventure. You've spent 20 years fighting other people's battles. Maybe it's time to figure out what Sharon Matthews wants, separate from what the movement needs. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street, their laughter filling the evening air. Sharon thought about how different this scene was from her own childhood, when playing outside often meant navigating spaces where you weren't entirely welcome. These kids, black, brown, white, all playing together, they were growing up in a world that Sharon's generation had fought to create. Not perfect but better. I'm proud of you, her mother said quietly. Not for what you accomplished, though that's remarkable, but for knowing when to step back. For trusting others to carry the torch. For understanding that true leadership isn't about being indispensable, it's about making yourself unnecessary. 6 months later, Sharon stood in a university lecture hall, looking out at 200 students taking her new course, From Trauma to Transformation, Building Sustainable Justice Movements. It was the first semester of her appointment as a visiting professor, a role she'd accepted to share everything she'd learned with the next generation. When people ask me about that day 20 years ago, Sharon told her students, they usually want to hear about the drama. About being dragged out of the mall, about buying the building, about the victory. But that's not the story that matters. The story that matters is what came after. The years of unglamorous work. The small victories and major setbacks. The times I wanted to quit. The times I did quit for a day or a week before forcing myself to get back up. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Do you regret it? The toll it took on your personal life, your peace of mind? Sharon considered the question carefully. I don't believe in regret. I made choices and those choices had consequences, good and bad. Did I sacrifice things? Absolutely. Relationships that couldn't withstand the intensity of the work. Peace of mind, at least for long stretches. A certain kind of normalcy. But I also gained things. Purpose, community, the knowledge that I used my privilege and resources to make the world more just. Would I do it again? Yes. But would I do it exactly the same way? No. I'd take better care of myself. I'd build and rest from the beginning. I'd trust others sooner. I'd remember that I'm human, not a machine. Another student spoke up. The world still isn't fair. People of color still face discrimination every day. Was it worth it if the problems still exist? Sharon smiled. That's the wrong question. The right question is, are things better than they were? And the answer is yes. Not perfect, not finished, but better. 800 people are free who shouldn't have been in prison. Millions of retail workers have been trained to recognize and interrupt their biases. Laws have been changed. Young people like you are growing up knowing that standing up against injustice is possible. That's not nothing. That's everything. She paused, her voice growing softer. Here's what I want you to understand. You don't fight for justice because you're guaranteed to win. You fight because it's right. Because dignity matters. Because every small victory makes the next fight a little easier for the next person. You plant trees whose shade you'll never sit under. That's the work. Not glamorous, not always rewarding, but necessary. After class, several students stayed behind with questions, wanting to hear more stories, seeking guidance for their own activist work. Sharon stayed as long as they needed, remembering how desperately she'd wanted mentorship when she was starting out. One young man, a black student who reminded Sharon of Marcus Webb at that age, lingered after everyone else had left. Ms. Matthews, I was racially profiled last week. At a bookstore near campus. The security guard followed me around, accused me of stealing when I was literally holding books I was about to buy. And I left. I didn't fight back. I didn't demand justice. I just left and I feel like I failed. Sharon's heart ached with recognition. You didn't fail. You survived. That's not failure, that's self-preservation. Not every moment of injustice has to be your hill to die on. Sometimes you need to protect your peace and your safety. The fact that you're here, learning how to create systemic change instead of just reacting to individual incidents, that's wisdom, not weakness. The student's eyes filled with tears. But you fought back. You bought them all. I fought back because I had resources that protected me, Sharon said gently. Money for lawyers, connections to powerful people, a platform that amplified my voice. You don't have to be me to make a difference. You just have to be you, using whatever tools you have, fighting whatever battles you're equipped to fight. There's no one right way to resist injustice. There's only your way. A year after stepping down, Sharon published her book, Dignity is Not Negotiable, 20 Years Fighting Retail Racism. It became a bestseller not because people wanted celebrity stories, but because Sharon had written with unflinching honesty about both the triumphs and the failures, the victories and the costs. She went on a book tour, speaking in bookstores and community centers rather than prestigious venues. She wanted to reach ordinary people, not just activists and academics. In every city, people lined up to share their own stories with her. Moments they'd been profiled, discriminated against, made to feel less than human. Sharon listened to every story, validated every experience, and reminded every person that their dignity mattered. She'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply witness someone else's pain and tell them, "I believe you. You're not crazy. What happened to you was wrong." On the 20th anniversary of the Prestige Plaza incident, Sharon returned to the mall. It had been transformed beyond recognition. Where Luminaire once stood was now a community center offering free legal aid, job training, and youth programs. The entire top floor had been converted into affordable office space for minority-owned businesses. The mall wasn't just a shopping center anymore, it was a community hub, a space that truly served everyone. Jasmine Williams, who'd been that terrified young employee 20 years ago, was now the mall's director of community engagement. She'd grown into a powerful leader in her own right, implementing programs Sharon had never imagined. "You did this," Sharon told her, looking around at the thriving space. "No," Jasmine corrected. "We did this. You showed me it was possible. I made it real." That evening there was a celebration at the mall, not for Sharon though she was honored, but for the movement. Hundreds of people gathered, representing 2 decades of work. There were people who'd been freed from wrongful convictions now living full lives. Young activists who'd been inspired by Sharon's story and had gone on to lead their own campaigns. Retail workers who'd been trained in anti-bias practices and had prevented countless incidents of discrimination. Families who'd been torn apart by injustice and had been reunited. Aaliyah James, now leading the Matthews Justice Initiative with remarkable success, took the microphone. "Sharon Matthews changed my life. When I was 16 I was arrested for shoplifting, falsely accused just like she was. But unlike Sharon, I didn't have resources. I spent 3 months in juvenile detention before the charges were dropped. Those 3 months derailed my entire teenage years. I fell behind in school, lost my sense of self-worth, carried the shame of that arrest for years." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Then when I was in college I heard Sharon speak. And she said something that changed everything for me. She said, "What happened to you wasn't your fault, but what you do next is your choice." That simple statement freed me. It let me stop carrying shame for something I didn't do and start channeling my anger into action. Sharon didn't just build an organization. She built a permission structure for people like me to transform our pain into power. Aaliyah looked directly at Sharon. "You taught us that dignity isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's something we claim for ourselves and defend for others. And that lesson will outlive all of us." Sharon stood to speak, and the crowd erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. When it finally quieted, she looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, representing every background, united by a commitment to justice. 20 years ago, I walked into a store in this mall and was treated as if I didn't belong. Today I stand here surrounded by proof that we all belong. Every single one of us. And that's not because I bought a building. It's because thousands of people decided that dignity matters. That justice is worth fighting for. That the world we inherited isn't the world we have to accept. Sharon's voice grew thick with emotion. "I've spent 20 years fighting and I'm tired. Not defeated, but tired. And that's okay. Because this movement was never about me. It was about us. About building something bigger than any one person. And looking around this room, seeing the leaders you've become, the work you're doing, the lives you're changing, I know that the fight will continue long after I'm gone." She paused, gathering her thoughts for what she wanted to say next. "My mother told me something when I was young that I've never forgotten. Baby, they're going to try to make you small your whole life. People will tell you where you don't belong, what you can't do, who you can't be. Your job is to refuse. To stand tall. To take up space. To be so fully yourself that you give others permission to do the same." That's what this movement has always been about, refusing to be made small. Claiming our full humanity. Demanding that the world see us as we truly are. Sharon looked up at the ceiling, thinking about all the battles fought, all the victories won, all the lives changed within these walls and beyond them. "I don't know what the next 20 years will bring. But I know that you, all of you, will be leading the fight. And that gives me hope. Not naive hope, but earned hope. The kind of hope that comes from seeing real change, from witnessing transformation, from knowing that justice isn't just a dream but a destination we're actively building toward. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. The little girl who pressed her face against store windows grew up to buy them all. But the real miracle isn't the building. It's all of you. It's the movement we've built together. It's the world we're creating, one fight, one victory, one reclaimed dignity at a time. The crowd stood, applauding, many crying. Sharon looked around the mall one last time, this space that had been the site of her greatest humiliation and her greatest triumph. This place where everything had changed. As the celebration continued around her, Sharon slipped away quietly. She walked out the same doors where she'd been thrown 20 years ago, but this time on her own terms, her head held high. Her mother was waiting for her outside, leaning on a cane now but still strong, still fierce. "Ready to go home, baby?" her mother asked. "Yeah, Mama. I'm ready." They walked to the car together, and as Sharon drove away from Prestige Plaza for the last time, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The work would continue. The movement would grow. The fight would go on. But for Sharon Matthews, this chapter was complete. She'd been dragged out of a mall as if she were worthless. She'd walked back in and proven that her worth, and the worth of every person who looked like her, was infinite. She'd bought the building, yes. But more importantly, she'd built a movement. She'd changed laws. She'd freed the innocent. She'd inspired a generation. She'd planted trees whose shade would shelter people she'd never meet. And now, at 50 years old, Sharon Matthews was finally ready to rest. Not to stop living but to stop fighting quite so hard. To enjoy the world she'd helped create. To sit in the shade of the trees she'd planted. As they drove through the Chicago streets, her mother reached over and took her hand. "You did good, baby. You did real good." Sharon smiled, feeling peace settle over her like a warm blanket. "We did good, Mama. All of us together." And that, Sharon knew, was the truest victory of all. The story that started with humiliation ended with hope. The journey that began with injustice ended with transformation. The fight that started with one woman's refusal to accept degradation ended with a movement that changed the world. Sharon Matthews had been dragged out of a mall 20 years ago. She'd walked back in and bought it. But what she'd really bought was something money could never purchase. The freedom for the next generation to walk through any door into any space with their heads held high, knowing they belonged. And that freedom, that dignity, that justice, that was priceless. That was everything. That was enough.